in the introduction, you heard that I'm not just only focused on parking. And today, this is not just targeted at parking. This is going to change everything we believe about cities, the way we organize them. It's going to have an impact on every single property type, not just parking. And it's something where I don't think we have a lot of answers today, but hopefully we have a lot of questions. And hopefully over the next number of years, we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about those questions so we're prepared to take advantage of the change instead of being a victim of the change. Because ultimately, change is opportunity as long as you look at it that way. So, I'm going to quickly go through a couple things here. Everybody always talks about autonomous vehicles today very loosely. And ultimately, there really are, according to the NTSB, 5 levels, starting with 0, which I say aren't there really only 4 levels, but I'm told there are 5, where there's no automation. Today, the most advanced cars on the road are a level 2. We will eventually get to a level 4, and a level 4 will be when we aren't involved in driving the vehicle at all. A lot of big companies are spending a lot of money to prove this up. So I guess I'm blocking here. So if you think about just the kinds of resources that are being brought to bear on this issue, my personal belief is that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when all this is going to come about. I think some of the projections of it happening relatively quickly are overly enthusiastic and often involve modeling that doesn't take into account a lot of the real world realities of what happens out there on the streets. But clearly a lot of people are investing a lot of time and effort in this. There's all kinds of different beliefs about technology. I'm not going to go through all the technologies, but needless to say that part of what has to happen here is not only does the car have to be autonomous, but it also will talk, communicate with all the other cars, and also communicate with the infrastructure. And that means that until we are pretty much totally autonomous, it's not going to be very efficient because those damn humans out there driving their own cars are going to create a lot of problems for the autonomous vehicles really gaining efficiency. So there's a significant changeover effect here that we'll all be dealing with. And on the infrastructure side, much of the infrastructure is going to need to be paid for by municipalities. And I was reading an article yesterday by one of the think tank guys where he said, well, all the infrastructure in America already is crap. We already need to replace all of it, so they'll just replace it with the right stuff this time. Well, I suspect that some of us understand why the existing infrastructure is not being replaced, because the resources aren't there. And so to think that magically we're going to be able to replace it all tomorrow with infrastructure that's smart infrastructure, so we can eventually get to the promised land, which is the CAVs, which is the connected autonomous vehicles, is probably not going to happen overnight. So I think we all have time to plan here. All right. My overly ambitious senior associate put a little video up there to show you some of the technology and work. We'll just skip through that. And then here's what we're going to talk mostly about today. We're going to talk about the components where I think we're going to see some big impacts. We're going to talk about the human safety issue, the infrastructure issue. We're going to talk about the suburbanization versus urbanization debate, the impact on retail, the impact on employment, and then ultimately the impact on parking operations. So the main case, obviously, for going autonomous is humans are really lousy drivers. We're killing 30,000 people a year on our highways, and the estimates are that about 94% of those fatalities are generated by a human error. And so if you really could get the human out of the equation, like my 92-year-old father who should no longer be driving, if you see him in Boca Raton, give him a lot of girth. I mean, give him a lot of room because he thinks he's doing really well. That's the debate we're having. And by the way, with all the baby boomers aging, there'll be a lot of pressure to get this solution so that baby boomers can still have mobility and not have their kids take away their license like I'm trying to do right now. Then, there's the cost, $300 billion a year of economic cost. And, there's a there's a whole bunch of projections about what would happen if we could go autonomous. Some people project we'd only need 1/10 of the cars. I will tell you that's baloney. But the other thing is that assuming that you're going to have all this infrastructure, it's actually quite expensive. And it involves, in most cases, cities beginning to tell people you cannot drive your own vehicle. I'd like to see the politician who wants to take that one on right now. So, people always point to the fact that there's somewhere between 800 million and 1.2 billion parking spaces. I always like to focus on the paid parking portion, which obviously is much smaller. They talk about the efficiency we could generate, how we could nest cars much more tightly because there would no longer be a need to have humans in the structures. The cars would go in by themselves and nest. So the capacity of existing parking could be significantly increased. But bottom line, as we go through the change, no surprise to anybody in this room, surface lots are the easiest to repurpose to other uses. Subterranean parking garages are the most difficult to repurpose. A lot of people think we're going to create a lot of self-storage because of micro apartment units, but I'm not sure there'll be enough of those. And street parking is in jeopardy because we need all these queuing areas, because anybody who's seen the impact of Uber and Lyft already, there's not enough space along the curbs for everybody to match their car up with their customer. And the challenge with all these models is they assume the human actually shows up exactly when they're supposed to meet the vehicle. I don't know about any of you, but I don't find that to be my day-to-day experience. So maybe humans will start wearing shock collars, and when you're late, you'll start getting shocked to make sure you show up because you're supposed to be there. But I think while we have humans matching up with vehicles, it's not going to be as precise as some people would like it to be. From the Urban Land Institute's perspective, one of the biggest debates that's going on right now is, does this future change encourage more urbanization or more suburbanization? Now, people who believe in the urban model will tell you that we're going to be able to take a lot of vacant space that we use for parking and repurpose it for affordable housing, for green spaces, for public spaces, and that people will find that they don't need to own a car anymore, and this will create a nirvana where people want to be in urban cores. Conversely, people say, once I can be productive, going all the way from my house in the suburbs that has all this land that I like having, that has the good school system that is not often found in the urban core, and I can be productive the whole way back and forth because I'm not driving. So I'm doing my emails, I can video chat, I can do whatever I want to do that I would be doing in my office. I can plug into the Monday morning call on my way in. And if it truly is efficient, and if it truly, because all the cars are talking to each other, you're not caught in traffic jams, and they can run 8 inches apart so you get more capacity, will that encourage people to in fact go back to more of a sprawl model? And this is a big debate, and I'm not going to take a position because I don't know. But I do think that is a big question. Retail is probably the property type that's going to be most impacted here, because we already talked about where people live may be urban or suburban, so that'll affect housing. That'll also affect, obviously, office potentially, separate from all the other trends in office of whether or not people will continue to need a physical location. But the big issue in retail is the last mile. The only thing that's stopping Amazon from taking over the world is the last mile. That last mile delivery cost is very expensive. You've seen they've begun to drop at the post offices, at the P.O. boxes, and doing other things to try to not deliver that last mile. Once you have autonomous vehicles, if you'd gone to the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas last year, about 25% of the entire show was on autonomous vehicles. And the one that really struck me was Volkswagen had a concept car, which was an autonomous car, and the back of the car, instead of the traditional trunk space, was 2 compartments, one that was refrigerated, one that wasn't. And their view of the future is that while you're sleeping, this autonomous car will run around with a code that's sent to the fulfillment center so they can get into your vehicle. And they will pick up your dry cleaning, they'll pick up your Amazon packages, they'll pick up your groceries, they'll get all the things that you need to go out and get in your neighborhood. And when you wake up in the morning, you'll go in there, it's all sitting in the refrigerated compartment if it's refrigerated, or in the non-refrigerated compartment if it's not. So you won't really need your local Walgreens. You won't really need most of the big box retail. And so if in fact, and there's another model, by the way, where instead of it being your vehicle, it's another vehicle, but there's a pod that is basically inserted into the vehicle, that it's the pod that's dropped off to your place of residence while you're sleeping. So there are different concepts about how to do the same thing, but in both cases, the last mile of retail issue gets solved, and that means that a lot of retail in a lot of places today becomes obsolete very quickly. So it could have a pretty significant impact on retail. Then jobs. This is just some of the obvious ones. I mean, as you probably know, the #1 job in America, job title, is truck driver. There's 3 million of them. One of the first things that'll go autonomous is trucks. You won't have to worry about the labor issues of when are they tired, and when do they have to pull over, and when do they have to sleep, and the autonomous vehicles just go. And so you not only have Uber and Lyft actively looking at how to get the driver out of the cost equation, you have a lot of logistics and freight companies looking at this. That'll also dramatically change warehouse distribution too, and where it may be and how it's structured. So, and this is even getting into some of the, when I saw the list originally, I told my associate to put this together. I said, well, give me at least one example that's not driving. So he put in the automotive body paint, interior, and glass repair. There are 256,000 people in the country doing that. If we're not going to have accidents anymore, it's going to be many fewer people doing that. But if you want to take this to its logical conclusion, if you're not going to have the kind of insurance losses, you won't need as many people in insurance. If you're not going to have the kind of trauma and accidents, you're not going to need as many surgeons. You're not going to need as many trauma centers. You're not going to need a lot of things. You start going down the list, and the negative side of all this is it could dramatically reduce employment, separate from the fact that you won't need valets anymore. So the point is that this will create a societal burden that's quite immense, and I think that there could be a lot of resistance at the political level to putting all these people out of jobs. So something to watch. Once again, not tomorrow. Here are the timing predictions, just to give you how they're all over the board. Ford just recently, as a couple weeks ago, came out and said they're now going to have fully autonomous driverless vehicles for commercial ride sharing by 2021. GM has indicated they'll have some form of implementation by 2020. The Victoria Transport Policy Institute, who's a leading thinker in the space, thinks they'll become legal in 2025, but until 2040s, there won't be widespread adoption because a lot of the issues you have to get through. Toyota's going to come out with a highway only by 2020. Uber wants to be driverless by 2030. Green Street Advisors, the leading real estate research firm, is saying 2045 is a reasonable bet for mass adoption. And then you've got projections of how many vehicles will be coming out with different capabilities in the last one. There's very high cost to a lot of this technology. It will come down obviously with mass production, but today the LiDAR system on the Google vehicle costs $75,000. The issue about insurance is going to be a big issue. Are you still insuring the driver? Well, there is no driver. Are you insuring the vehicle? Well, is the manufacturer insuring it, or is the buyer insuring it? In other words, where in the insurance chain does somebody take responsibility for accidents? And there's a massive programming issue here. I'll give you the one that's most commonly cited. These cars, because they can operate in a fraction of a second, will actually be able to make the following decision. It's going down the road, mother and child standing on the sidewalk. Child's holding a ball. Ball falls into the street. Child follows the ball in the street. The vehicle has to be programmed to kill the child or kill the mother. Which one does it kill? And these will be massive ethical issues that will have to be written into law, because nobody's going to want to insure it unless it's already been agreed as public policy, this is what we're going to do, because the car will actually be programmed to make that decision. If it's programmed not to swerve, it's just always going to hit what's in the road, that's another approach. But there will be programming decisions that have to be made here. Oh, government regulation, very timely, since yesterday the the National Highway Transportation Safety Agency came out with their 15 safety points. They're going to encourage the development of this technology as long as it's within the 15 safety guidelines, which I think was their first step to try to bring some order to this. As you will see in the next slide, today what's happening is states are one by one passing legislation to start trying to deal with the issue. You've heard that Pittsburgh agreed to do the test that they've now embarked on. Others have agreed, and some states, such as Michigan, not surprisingly, with its large legacy automobile business, is both trying to be a leader in the new technology but not have it arrive quite too soon. So you will see more and more of this, but there ultimately will need to be a federal overlay. Otherwise, it's obviously not going to work state by state. And then cybersecurity. How many people remember the story about the Jeep that got taken over remotely because of its because of the computer in the car being hacked? Well, these vehicles can all be hacked. And so if you want to start talking about security issues, both physical security in terms of what the vehicle's doing, security in terms of what the occupant is tapping into and using while they're driving. There's a lot of different issues here relative to cybersecurity, but the safety one is the biggest one because you don't want somebody else controlling your vehicle when you don't control it. So that will be a big issue. Parking. While I think many of the prognostications are overly severe about how little parking is going to be needed, I do think that the long-term trend is a reduction on the amount of parking we need, plus the amount of parking we have will be much more efficiently used when the cars can nest themselves and we don't need to keep any human capacity inside of the structures. So that will be a big change coming along. The other big issue is how many people are going to go to the shared model. I mean, every professor in the country at every major university says none of you are going to own your own car. Everybody's just going to do the shared model. My friends that I talk to don't necessarily agree with that interpretation of what's going to happen, so maybe you all agree with the professors, but I think there'll be a blend of a certain number of people who use a shared vehicle, being part of a fleet, similar to an Uber experience. And there'll be a certain number of people, start with the fact that assuming we're still building buildings, workmen are still going to want their work trucks with all their tools and all their other things. A certain number of families are still going to want to have a vehicle with the car seats and all the other things in it. A certain number of people just like having their own vehicle. So I'm not sure that the whole world is going to go to a shared model, but most of the prognostications about what's going to happen to parking are based upon the fact that nobody's going to own a car anymore. The other thing I would point out about that is that with the need for keeping capacity on the road, it's likely that there will be pressure by the government because all the parking on street will be used now for people to get picked up. They're going to lose that revenue, so they're going to want revenue for when people are queuing. They're going to want revenue when you're using the road, particularly if you don't have a passenger, because you're using up road capacity with an empty vehicle. And so there's going to be pressure for these vehicles to go nest between use. And as we all know, there are peak times of the day. And so based upon the peak times of the day, take O'Hare Airport on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, not every car is going to be able to show up at the last minute and get into the airport. There's talk then about a lot of adjustments to how we move people in airports. But the biggest issue, I think, ultimately of all this is actually that I think mass transit's in big trouble. Fixed rail particularly, because it's an expensive, heavily subsidized, rigid system. And when you can start doing 6 and 8 passenger vans that can customize based upon people hitting their phone wanting to be picked up, customize the optimized path between point A and point B, picking people up and dropping them on the way, it'll be a lot less expensive and it'll be a much better product. So I think there are going to be a lot of pressures on public infrastructure that's particularly fixed rail. The per mile cost of this is supposed to be about half. If you go shared, your per mile cost should be about half or less what you're paying today. I remember from economics, and maybe all of you took the same class, that when you reduce the cost of a good significantly, what normally happens to demand? Normally goes up. Somehow that's not in any of these models. Nobody's going to use more transportation when it's a lot less expensive and a lot more convenient. Strikes me there will be more vehicles because of that factor. Even if there's an offset of fewer vehicles, more people are sharing. So there's just a lot of, let alone, do you want your car to go pick up your dry cleaning overnight? So there's just a lot of unknowns. And I would tell you that there will be a significant transitional period here. It's going to impact every form of real estate. It's going to impact how we plan cities, how we organize cities, and that's even assuming that the suburban model doesn't start to take away demand from the urban cores. So it's going to be a fun time. I mean, I like change, so for me, it's great stuff. So impacts on the industry. If you aren't already, I'll take in our case, at the parking spot, our fastest growing department for the last 3 years is technology. We're now up to 20 people doing technology, and we'll keep growing. If you're not, sorry about that, if you're not investing in technology today and really using it to improve the customer experience, you will be roadkill because the customer is going to demand it, and those who don't have it, we're going to be left out in the cold. And this isn't just, by the way, true of parking. I'm going to say the same thing for housing and for retail, but parking probably is a more dramatic example that if you aren't embracing technology, you will have a lot of challenges. And I think there'll be more and more partnerships between independent technology companies in the parking space with operators, with owners, there's going to be a lot more of a technology feed. Yep. There'll be fewer jobs. Historically, not anymore, but think back 20 years ago. Most parking companies were in the business of leasing employees. That was the basic business. People had a piece of real estate they needed run, and you came and you managed it, and you brought the employees, and you hired them, and you trained them, and that was the basic model. It's not going to be that way anymore. It's going to be much more about bringing the technology. Demand curve. It's really hard to figure out what the demand curve is going to be because, number one, we have the urban versus suburban. We've got the shared model versus the owned model. We've got the issue about how fast does all the smart infrastructure come about. And so I think that one of the things to really watch closely is the demand curve because I don't think we can predict it today. And there's even the issue about location, because if I, as a customer, park with you because you're right next to the building I'm going to, but I'm going to be dropped in front of the building anywhere, and I don't really care where that car goes and parks, unless there are superimposed costs by the city saying, I don't want that car driving all the way out of the city to come all the way back in the city to create traffic. It really is hard to predict the demand curves, because historically it's been really easy. You look at the demand generators, and the closest parking to that demand generator is the most valuable, and you start doing segmentation as you get greater distances. This changes all of those aspects of demand models. So anyway, I'm sure I've been a really uplifting speaker relative to the challenges facing our business, because I think everything's in play. And I don't know if I have time to take a question or two or not. Maybe that's your answer. Your 2 questions. I'm allowed to take 2 questions. Let's make them good. Well, the question is, obviously, if the cost of a shared car comes down, the cost of an owned car comes down too, because some of the same elements like the insurance should come down significantly. The models I'm referring to, they're trying to adjust for both and looking forward, because the main thing that you're getting in a shared solution is the capital assets being used more intensively. So instead of the car being used on average, an average vehicle is used 4 or 5% of its life. And there are peak days in the day where there's 15% of all capacity is in use. So theoretically, 6 people could share a car is the math. And so if 6 people are sharing the capital good, depending how expensive the capital good is, that's what brings down the cost. of course, it increases the maintenance. And so the other thing that they're trying to evaluate is that when these vehicles are being used all the time, and a future use for some parking facilities will be maintenance facilities that when these cars have that 2-hour gap, when there's a low demand and they need to be serviced, they'll run into a facility and get serviced because they'll need more service with the amount of use they're getting, similar to a commercial airplane. So, you know, but you're pointing out there are so many variables. So that was a great number one question. Who's got the second one? Going once, going twice. Thank you very much.